Somewhere along the way, compersion turned into a merit badge. You're supposed to feel it, then prove you feel it, then post about how much you feel it. And if you don't feel it yet, something is wrong with you, or you're not evolved enough, or you're secretly still monogamous underneath it all. Here's what nobody tells you in the group chats and the panel talks. Compersion is not a switch you flip by wanting to be enlightened enough. It's not proof you've done your work. It's a nervous system state, and nervous systems don't take orders from your ideology, no matter how good that ideology is. Today, we're talking about what compersion actually is, what it isn't, and why chasing it might be the exact thing keeping it out of reach. Welcome to Untamed Ember. I'm Dr. Misty. If you've spent any real time in ethical non-monogamy spaces, you've heard compersion talked about like it's the finish line. Feeling joy watching your partner fall for someone else and you've made it. Don't feel it yet, and you're apparently doing this wrong. I want to take that pressure apart today, piece by piece, and replace it with something more honest and a lot more useful. What your body actually needs before compersion becomes available to you at all. Let's start with the actual definition, because it has been stretched and warped by internet discourse until it barely resembles what the term was built to describe. Compersion is the experience of feeling joy, warmth, or vicarious pleasure in response to your partner's happiness in another relationship. That's the whole definition. It is not a personality trait. It is not a permanent state you either have or you don't. It's not a replacement for jealousy that's supposed to show up the instant jealousy clears the room. The word itself came out of intentional community spaces in the 1970s and 80s, coined specifically because English didn't have language for this particular experience yet. People needed a name for something real they were feeling, so they built one. That's all a word is supposed to do, name something true. Here's the part that got lost somewhere between then and now. Compersion was never meant to be a requirement. It was meant to be a description. A word for something that happens sometimes in some relationships at some moments when the conditions are right. Somewhere between a 1980s intentional community and your last polyamory infographic, a description quietly turned into a demand. I want to introduce you to someone who lived the gap between those two versions of the word. I'll call her Priya. She's a composite drawn from patterns I've seen across a lot of clients, not one specific person. And every identifying detail has been changed to protect confidentiality. Priya opened her relationship a little over 3 years ago after years of feeling like something about exclusivity never quite fit the way she was told it was supposed to. And in year 1, she did what a lot of newly non-monogamous people do. She read the definition of compersion, decided that feeling was the goal, and started performing it long before she actually felt it. One more thing about that original definition before we move on. The people who coined it in those intentional communities weren't trying to build a new standard everyone had to hit. They were trying to describe something that had surprised them. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because a description invites curiosity and a standard invites anxiety. We inherited the word, and somewhere along the way, we lost the curiosity and kept the anxiety. That performance didn't happen in a vacuum, and understanding where the pressure came from matters just as much as understanding the feeling itself. I want to name something plainly because naming systems instead of just symptoms is the whole point of this show. There is an entire cottage industry now around compersion. Infographics, merch, panel discussions where people describe their compersion like a personal best in a race. Apparently, everyone is also running. And underneath of it all sits the same scarcity logic that built compulsory monogamy in the first place, just wearing a different outfit. Compulsory monogamy told you there's only enough love, attention, and security to go around if it stays contained to one person. A lot of ENM culture, without meaning to, rebuilt that same scarcity model and pointed it at your own nervous system instead. Now the scarce resource isn't your partner's attention. It's your own emotional evolution. If you don't have enough compersion, you must not have done enough work. That's the same conditioning wearing a new outfit. It just moved from policing who you're allowed to love to policing what you're allowed to feel about who you love. Neither version was ever about your actual well-being. Both versions were about compliance with an image of what a good partner is supposed to look like from the outside. Priya told me once that in that first year, she spent more energy managing what her face looked like when Mateo, her partner, came home from a date than she spent on anything else that night. Not processing her own experience, not noticing what was true in her body, but managing her face. That is the compersion industrial complex doing exactly what it's built to do. Turning an internal, unpredictable nervous system level experience into a performance metric. If any of that sounds familiar for reasons that have nothing to do with polyamory, it should. This is the same mechanism a lot of neurodivergent people already know intimately from masking. You learn early that your actual internal state is an acceptable output, so you build a second, more presentable version to show the room. The compersion industrial complex just handed that same demand to an entire community and called it emotional evolution instead of what it actually is, which is compliance dressed up as growth. And it fits neatly into a much bigger cultural pattern. We live inside a productivity culture that creates every internal state as something to optimize, including states that were never supposed to be optimized in the first place. Grief gets a 5-stage timeline. Rest gets tracked in an app. And now joy on someone else's behalf gets treated the same way, as a metric you're behind on if you haven't hit it yet. Naming that pattern out loud is the first move, because you cannot dismantle a system you've mistaken for your own personal failing. So before we go any further, let's clear out the myths this industry runs on, because you can't build something honest on top of a foundation that's already lying to you. That's exactly where we're headed next. Let's talk about what compersion is not, because the myths do almost as much damage as the pressure itself. Before we move into the myths, I want to name something directly for the trauma-impacted and neurodivergent folks listening, because a generic conversation about compersion tends to erase you by default. And this show doesn't do that. If you have a trauma history involving betrayal, abandonment, or unpredictable caregiving, your threat detection system likely runs with a lower threshold and a longer memory than someone without that history. That's not damage. That's a nervous system that learned its lessons well from real experience. It means the road to felt safety inside a new relationship structure may genuinely take longer, and that timeline is not a referendum on how you healed. And if you're neurodivergent, autonomic regulation itself can simply work differently for you at baseline, independent of any trauma history at all. Sensory load, transition difficulty, and a nervous system that runs hot or shuts down fast under uncertainty are not obstacles standing between you and compersion. They're just part of your operating system, and any framework for building safety needs to work with that system rather than treat it as a defect to override. None of this changes the underlying mechanism. Safety still has to come before joy for everyone. It just means the path to that safety looks different depending on the body walking it. And a body that needs more time, more structure, or more predictability than someone else isn't behind. It's working with different terrain. Compersion is not the absence of jealousy. Those two things aren't opposite ends of one dial. You can feel a flicker of jealousy and a flicker of compersion in the same 5 minutes, sometimes in the same breath. Your nervous system is not a one feeling at a time machine, no matter how badly certain corners of this community want it to be. Compersion is not required for ethical non-monogamy to be valid. You can build a genuinely healthy, consensual, thriving, multi-partner life and never feel it consistently. Plenty of people manage jealousy well, communicate with total honesty, and support their partner's other relationships out of respect and love, without a swell of vicarious joy showing up every time. That is not a lesser version of polyamory. That is polyamory, full stop. And compersion is not a moral scoreboard. I've sat across from clients who treated their compersion or lack of it as a referendum on whether they were a good enough partner, a good enough person, evolved enough to deserve the relationship structure they had chosen. That's conditioning talking, not clinical reality. So let's go to the actual clinical reality because it changes the entire conversation. Here is the piece of polyvagal theory that matters most today. Your nervous system operates in a rough hierarchy, and it does not hand out access to positive, expansive, connective states until it has already confirmed that you're safe. When you're in sympathetic activation, fight or flight, your body is scanning for danger and mobilizing to handle it. When you're in a dorsal shutdown, your body has decided the threat is too big to fight or flee. So it collapses and conserves. Neither state has room left over for vicarious joy on someone else's behalf. There is no spare bandwidth. Joy for another person is a luxury good, physiologically speaking, and your body will not spend it while it still suspects it might be under threat. Compersion lives almost exclusively in what polyvagal theory calls the ventral vagal state. That's your body's social engagement state, the state where you feel safe enough to connect, to play, to be curious, to let someone else's good fortune land as good news instead of bad news. It's the same system responsible for warmth, humor, and genuine curiosity about another person's inner world. So when someone tells you to just try harder to feel happy for your partner's date, they are asking a system that has no authority here to override a system that absolutely does. Willpower lives in the prefrontal cortex. Compersion lives in a much older, much faster part of your nervous system, and that part answers to safety cues, not to arguments. There's also a piece of this that explains why compersion seems to come so easily to some people and feels almost mythical to others. And it has nothing to do with how enlightened anyone is. Think of your autonomic nervous system as a ladder with 3 rungs. At the bottom sits dorsal shutdown, collapse, and conservation, the state where almost nothing feels available, including connection. In the middle sits sympathetic activation, mobilized, alert, ready to fight or flee. At the top sits the ventral vagal state, safety, connection, curiosity, and play. You cannot skip rungs. A nervous system stuck on the bottom or middle rung has to climb back up to the top one before an experience like compersion becomes physiologically available, no matter how much someone wants to feel it from where they currently stand. Your baseline autonomic state, meaning how much of your daily life you spend already resting on that top rung, versus how much time you spend braced on the middle or bottom one, is shaped by everything from attachment history to trauma history to how your particular nervous system happens to be wired. Someone with a history of relational safety starts this whole process closer to the ventral state already, and someone with a history of relational unpredictability or someone whose nervous system runs hotter for entirely neurodivergent reasons that have nothing to do with trauma at all starts farther from it. Neither starting point says anything about character. It says something about history and wiring, which are 2 very different things from moral effort. On top of that, actual vicarious joy recruits the same neural circuitry involved in empathy and social bonding, including the release of oxytocin, the same chemical involved in attachment and trust. That system only comes online reliably once the threat detection system has stood down. You cannot have a strong empathic mirroring response to someone's happiness while a threat circuit is simultaneously telling you that happiness is dangerous. The 2 systems are, in a very literal physiological sense, competing for the same resources. And that mismatch between the system you're trying to use and the system that actually holds the answer is exactly what makes performing compersion so costly. So when you force a feeling you don't have, your body doesn't just fail to produce the feeling, it pays for the attempt. Masking an internal state takes active regulation, and active regulation is metabolically expensive. Every minute Priya spent managing her expression around Mateo was a minute her sympathetic nervous system stayed partially engaged, because some part of her was still working, still bracing, still on alert underneath the performance. This is the same mechanism therapists see in chronic fawning and in masking more broadly. The nervous system doesn't get a break just because the face on top is doing something calm. If anything, holding a performance steady while an internal alarm is going off underneath takes more energy than either just having the alarm or just having the calm. So here is the double bind Priya was stuck in without realizing it. Feeling threatened without expressing it kept her nervous system activated. Performing calm on top of that activation kept it activated even longer, because now her body was managing 2 jobs instead of 1. And every time she performed compersion, she didn't feel, she was quietly teaching her own nervous system that its honest signals weren't safe to show, which is the opposite of the safety that actual compersion requires to grow. So this is the trap. The harder you perform the feeling, the further you push yourself from the conditions that would let you actually have it. And there's a relational cost on top of the physiological one. When you perform compersion, you don't feel. Your partner receives false information about your actual state, which means they can't adjust anything that might genuinely help, because as far as they know, nothing needs adjusting. Priya's early performance didn't just cost her. It kept Matteo from realizing for months that she needed more structure and reassurance than he was providing, simply because her face kept telling him everything was fine. Priya didn't find her way out of that trap through more effort. She found her way out through something almost embarrassingly unglamorous. And I want to walk you through exactly how it happened. In that first year, every time Matteo went on a date, Priya sat at home rehearsing a happy face before he even walked out the door. She wanted so badly to be the kind of partner who felt compersion easily that she performed warmth she did not feel, sent enthusiastic texts mid-date, and then quietly fell apart once she was alone in the apartment. The performance did not calm her nervous system. It just added a second job on top of the first. What actually shifted for Priya was not more effort. It was more safety, built through specific, unglamorous, repeated practice. She and Matteo started a short check-in before every date. Nothing elaborate, just enough that her body wasn't left guessing about timing or plans. He agreed to send one text after he arrived, wherever he was going, so she wasn't constructing worst-case scenarios in the silence. And critically, he gave her explicit permission to say out loud when she was struggling, instead of performing fine for his benefit. None of that was designed to produce compersion directly. It was designed to give her nervous system enough evidence delivered over and over across months that this new structure was not a threat to the relationship underneath it. Evidence is what a nervous system actually runs on, not intentions, not values. Evidence repeated until it becomes believable at a level below conscious thought. Around month 3, the shift was almost nothing. She stopped rehearsing her face before he left because she started trusting the check-in ritual enough to just wait for the actual information instead of performing a reaction in advance. Around month 6, she noticed she could hold a normal conversation with a friend while Matteo was out, instead of checking her phone every few minutes. Around month 8, she got through an entire date night without checking the clock once. None of those were compersion. They were just the absence of hypervigilance, one layer at a time. And that absence is exactly what has to clear out of the way before anything warmer has room to arrive. Then, about 14 months in, it happened without her trying at all. Matteo texted her something small and funny his new partner had said during dinner. And Priya felt an honest, unforced warmth spread through her chest before she had time to even think about whether she was supposed to feel it. No performance, no effort. It just arrived because her body finally had enough safety on file to let it in. That is the whole argument of this episode, contained in one moment. She did not earn that feeling by wanting it more than she wanted it in year 1. She earned access to it by building a nervous system that no longer had to spend all its resources on threat detection every time Matteo's phone lit up. So let's get concrete. If compersion is downstream of safety rather than effort, what does building that safety actually look like in a real relationship, starting today? One layer I want to add before we move into practical territory, because it's clinically real and rarely talked about. Compersion and grief are not enemies either. You can feel genuine warmth toward your partner's new happiness while also grieving something about your own relationship changing shape, your available time together shrinking, or an old version of exclusivity you're still in the process of releasing. I've had clients describe this as feeling like a traitor to their own sadness, as if the presence of one warm feeling meant that the grief wasn't allowed to be real anymore. It works the other way too. Grief doesn't cancel compersion, and compersion doesn't cancel grief. Priya described exactly this around month 11. Before her big shift at month 14, she felt something warm hearing about one of Mateo's good dates, and in the very same conversation, felt a wave of sadness about how much less unstructured time they'd had together that month. Both were true. Neither one disqualified the other. I want to be honest about the tension some of you might be sitting with here, because pretending it isn't real would be worse than naming it. Some people worry that if they let grief and compersion coexist instead of resolving into one clean feeling, it means that they're actually not okay with the relationship structure that they've chosen. In my clinical experience, the opposite is usually true. Nervous systems that are forced to produce one tidy feeling on demand are the ones still performing. Nervous systems that can hold complexity without needing to resolve it are the ones that have actually arrived somewhere safer. So first, stop grading yourself. If compersion isn't here yet, that's data about your nervous system's current sense of safety, not a verdict on your character or your commitment to this relationship structure. The grading itself burns resources your body could be using to actually settle. Second, build predictability before you chase warmth. Predictability is fuel for the ventral vagal state. A quick check-in before a date, a text on arrival, an agreed upon time to reconnect afterward. None of that is about controlling your partner's other relationship. It's about giving your own nervous system enough information that it can stand down from scanning for threat. Third, let more than one feeling be true at once. You don't have to wait for jealousy to fully clear out before compersion gets to show up. Ask your body what's actually here right now, without deciding in advance which answer is the correct one. Sometimes the honest answer is a knot in your stomach and a small warm flicker in the same 10 seconds. Both of those are allowed to be real. Fourth, notice small moments instead of chasing big ones. Compersion rarely shows up first as some sweeping wave of joy. It shows up as a half second of ease, a genuine laugh at something your partner tells you, a moment where you forgot to brace. Track those. They're the early evidence that your body is starting to file this relationship structure under safe instead of under danger. And fifth, separate the request for reassurance from the demand for a feeling. It is completely fair to ask your partner for check-ins, timelines, and communication that helps you regulate. It's not fair to yourself to demand that you also feel delighted when you're asking for that support. You're allowed to need structure and still be somewhere short of joyful about the situation underneath it. Both are honest. Neither one cancels the other out. And sixth, track your baseline before you try to interpret a single hard night. If you're already running on poor sleep, a stressful week at work, or an unrelated conflict, your nervous system has less spare capacity for anything, compersion included, regardless of how safe the relationship actually is. Rule out the boring explanations before you assign meaning to a rough evening. And seventh, let your relationship to your metamor, meaning your partner's partner, develop on its own timeline, separate from your relationship to compersion. You don't need to like them, befriend them, or feel anything particular about them for your own nervous system work to be legitimate. Some people find that a warm relationship with a metamor accelerates safety. Others find that total independence between those relationships is what actually works for them. Neither path is more evolved than the other. Both are just different routes to the same felt safety. If you have more than one partner yourself, let each relationship build its own timeline towards safety without forcing them to match. The pace that worked with one partner may not be the pace that works with another, and holding all of them to an identical schedule usually just adds pressure without adding safety anywhere. I also want to speak directly to whoever is listening to this as the partner whose date is causing the activation, because you have real work here too. And it isn't about talking your partner into feeling something faster. Your job is not to produce compersion in someone else. You cannot regulate another person's nervous system by insisting they feel a certain way about your other relationship. What you can do is exactly what Matteo did. Offer predictability without being asked twice. Check in before you disappear into your evening. Send the text on arrival, not because you're managing your partner's emotions, but because you're handing their nervous system real information instead of silence to fill in on its own, and take their honest reporting seriously when it isn't what you were hoping to hear. Matteo didn't punish Priya for saying she was struggling. He didn't rush her toward evolved feelings on his timeline. He let her be exactly where she actually was, which counterintuitively is what made it safe enough for her to eventually be somewhere else. That's not a small thing to offer someone. Patience without an agenda attached to it is one of the most regulating experiences a nervous system can receive. One more note for partners specifically. Watch for your own relief masquerading as pressure. It is a completely understandable instinct to want your partner to feel good about your other relationship, both because you love them and because their struggle is uncomfortable for you too. But if you find yourself subtly pushing for compersion faster because their difficulty is hard for you to sit with, that pressure will register in their nervous system, exactly like every other version of this pressure we've talked about today. Your discomfort with their timeline is yours to manage, not theirs to resolve on your schedule. And one last thing before we get to your invitation for the week. Compersion is not a permanent unlock once it arrives. It's not a level you complete and then keep forever regardless of circumstance. A new partner enters the picture, a stressful season hits your career, your own health shifts, and the safety you build can wobble again. That's not backsliding. That's a nervous system responding accurately to new information the same way it always does. Priya still has nights, even now, where an old flicker of activation shows up around a date she'd normally feel easy about. She doesn't treat those nights as proof that all her work came undone. She treats them as information, checks what's changed that week, and returns to the same practices that built the safety in the first place. The goal was never a permanent, unshakable state. The goal was building a nervous system flexible enough to recover its footing when something knocks it loose. Here's what I want you to sit with this week. Not a demand to feel compersion, an invitation to notice, without editing, what's actually present in your body the next time your partner's other relationship comes up. No performance for them, no performance for yourself. Just honest noticing. If what shows up is jealousy, that's not a failure report. If what shows up is nothing much at all, that's not a failure report either. If what shows up is one unexpected half second of warmth, that's worth writing down, because that half second is your nervous system starting to trust something new. Next episode, we're staying in the body, and we're going somewhere I think you'll find genuinely practical. Co-regulation across multiple relationships. What it actually means to find your own ground before you try to find it with anyone else, and why that order matters more than almost anything else in this work. Before we close, I want to give you somewhere to land with this. Take a breath and bring to mind the last time your partner told you about someone else in their life, romantic or otherwise. Not to relive whatever came up, but just to notice right now what your body does with that memory. Where do you feel it? Is there tightness? Is there ease? Is there both? You don't have to change anything about what you find. You're not being graded on this. You're simply gathering information about where your nervous system actually is today, which is the only honest starting point for anything to shift from there. Now, think of one moment anywhere in your life, romantic or not, where you felt genuine, unforced happiness for someone else's good news. A friend's promotion, a sibling's engagement. Notice that your body already knows how to do this. The capacity for vicarious joy isn't missing from you. It's just waiting for enough safety in this particular part of your life to let it show up here too. You have permission to not feel compersion yet. You have permission to feel it in flashes and then lose it again. Your body is not behind schedule. It's building safety at exactly the pace safety actually gets built, which is slower than any infographic will tell you, and far more real. This has been Untamed Ember. I'm Dr. Misty. Compersion isn't a merit badge, and it was never supposed to be one. It's a byproduct of a nervous system that has learned it's safe, and you get to build that safety at your own pace, not the internet's. Subscribe to the Untamed Ember newsletter at untamedember.kit.com for deep dives, bonus material, and the behind-the-scenes content that doesn't make it into the episode. Next episode, we're talking about co-regulation across multiple relationships and what it actually takes to find your own ground first. We'll see you next time.